Verath Prime was the kind of world that was built to make visitors feel small. The planet itself was beautiful in a cold, deliberate way. Its surface was covered in crystalline towers that caught the light of its twin suns and scattered it into 1,000 colors. The gardens were sculpted using gravity manipulation, with rivers of water flowing upward into the sky, and trees growing sideways from floating platforms. Everything was designed with a precision that spoke of thousands of years of refinement, and none of it was accidental. Every pathway, every arch, every carefully placed beam of light was a message. You are young. You are small. You do not belong here. The resolute Dawn dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the edge of the Verath system and was immediately met by a Concord escort fleet. 12 warships, one from each elder species, formed a corridor through which the human carrier was expected to fly. It was meant to be an honor. Danny Whitmore recognized it for what it really was. A reminder that the Concorde had teeth. He stood on the bridge and watched the alien ships glide past on either side. Each one was different. The Veloxy cruiser was angular and black, bristling with sensor arrays. The Drawl dreadnought was a massive sphere of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Morvathi warship was sleek and predatory, built by a species that had turned warfare into an art form. Grace Dunlap stood beside him, cataloging every ship with her practiced eye. She said nothing, but Danny could see her making calculations in her head. How fast could they move? How many weapons they carried? How long the resolute Dawn could survive if things went badly? Relax, Grace, Danny said quietly. We are here to talk. I am relaxed, she replied, her voice perfectly even. I am also counting their guns. The two are not related. The delegation shuttle departed the resolute Dawn an hour later. Danny, Lillian, Paul, Grace, and Nathan sat in silence as the small craft descended through the atmosphere and landed on a platform at the base of the Grand Symposium complex. A Veloxy protocol officer met them at the landing pad. He was tall and insectoid, with multifaceted eyes that reflected the humans' faces back at them in fragmented pieces. He welcomed them in a clicking language that Lillian's earpiece translated into smooth, formal English, and he guided them through a series of corridors that grew wider and more ornate as they approached the amphitheater. The grand table was not a table at all. It was a circular amphitheater large enough to hold 10,000 beings. The ceiling was open to the sky, and the twin suns of Verath cast long golden shadows across the stone floor. 12 elevated platforms surrounded a central open area called the Speaking Ground. Each platform was occupied by the delegation of one of the elder species, seated high above the floor, so that anyone standing on the Speaking Ground had to look up at them. Danny understood the design immediately. The Speaking Ground was for petitioners, for the young, for the small. It was a stage on which newcomers were expected to stand and accept whatever judgment the Concorde handed down, surrounded on all sides by species that wanted them to feel surrounded. The human delegation was led to a small section of seating near the floor level, far below the elevated platforms. As they took their seats, Danny looked around the amphitheater. Thousands of alien beings filled the galleries. Diplomats, military officers, scholars, journalists, and observers from dozens of species, all gathered to watch the youngest civilization in the galaxy be taught its place. Nathan leaned close to Danny. Every species that has ever stood on that Speaking Ground has accepted the Concorde's terms, he whispered. Every single one. This ceremony has not changed in thousands of years. Everything changes eventually, Danny said. A deep, resonant tone echoed through the amphitheater, and the crowd fell silent. On the highest platform, directly opposite the main entrance, High Arbiter Zelkon of the Veloxy rose to speak. He was the oldest member of the Concord's ruling council, and his species had shared the alliance for 3,000 years. His body was thin and segmented, covered in a dark carapace that gleamed like polished obsidian. When he spoke, his mandibles clicked and whirred, and the translation system converted his words into a voice that was smooth, deep, and utterly without warmth. "We welcome the representatives of humanity to the Grand Symposium," Zelkon said. "You come before the Concord of 12 as a young species of great energy and potential. It is our hope that this gathering will help guide you toward a future that is prosperous, stable, and harmonious with the galactic order." Danny kept his face neutral. Beside him, Lillian was already translating the subtext. Guide meant control. Harmonious meant obedient. Prosperous meant useful to us. One by one, the elder species presented their grievances. The Rithani ambassador, a tall being with pale blue skin and 4 arms, accused humanity of expanding too aggressively into unclaimed star systems. He displayed star charts showing the speed of human colonization, and compared it unfavorably to the slower, more controlled expansion of elder species. His tone was patient and condescending, like a teacher correcting a child who did not know any better. The Draal delegate, a squat creature encased in a floating mechanical shell, condemned human weapons research. He listed 17 separate research programs that the Draal considered destabilizing, including advances in energy shielding, kinetic bombardment systems, and quantum disruption warheads. He called human military development reckless and a threat to the long peace. The Orothi representative, a slender being with smooth golden skin and large dark eyes, made what Danny found to be the most interesting accusation. She claimed that human cultural exports, music, films, literature, art, and philosophy, were contaminating younger species across the galaxy. She said that human ideas about individual freedom, self-determination, and personal rights were destabilizing the natural order of societies that had been stable for centuries. Danny felt Lillian tense beside him when this accusation was translated. He put a hand on her arm. "Not yet." The Morvathi speaker, a massive reptilian figure covered in dark green scales, addressed the issue of human military doctrine. He described human tactics as irrational and unpredictable, noting that human commanders had a disturbing tendency to take risks that no sane strategist would consider. He said that humanity's willingness to sacrifice, to fight against impossible odds, and to refuse surrender even when defeat was certain, made them an incalculable variable in galactic security planning. Danny almost smiled at that one. The Morvathi were warriors themselves. Coming from them, incalculable was almost a compliment. After the final accusation was delivered, the amphitheater was heavy with silence. Every alien face was turned toward the small human delegation seated near the floor. The message had been delivered clearly, and from every direction. Humanity was too aggressive, too dangerous, too creative, too unpredictable, and too free. The galaxy needed humanity to become something smaller, something quieter, something easier to manage. High Arbiter Zelkon gestured toward the speaking ground with one long segmented arm. "The delegation of humanity is invited to respond," he said. Danny looked at his team. Lillian gave him a small nod. Grace was motionless, her eyes tracking the room. Nathan was gripping his datapad tightly, his knuckles white. Paul Beckett met Danny's gaze and held it, and in that look was everything. The weight of what they were about to do. The billions of humans back home who had no idea their future was being decided in this room. And the simple, stubborn refusal to be afraid. Danny stood up. He buttoned his coat slowly, deliberately, taking his time. Then he walked to the center of the speaking ground, alone, and stood in the place where every species that had come before him had knelt. He did not kneel. He looked up at the 12 platforms towering above him, at the most powerful beings in the known galaxy, and he took a breath. And then he began to speak. The amphitheater was so quiet that Danny could hear the faint hum of the translation matrices embedded in every seat. 10,000 beings sat in perfect silence, watching a single human stand on the speaking ground below them. He looked small down there. That was the point of the design. Every species that had ever stood in that spot was meant to feel small. Danny Whitmore did not feel small. He felt steady. He felt like a man standing on solid ground, with nothing left to pretend about and nothing left to hide. He began simply. "I want to thank the Concord for inviting us here today," he said. His voice was calm and unhurried, the way he always spoke, as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use exactly as much of it as he needed. Humanity is young. We know this. We have been traveling between the stars for just over 100 years, and many of you have been doing it for thousands. We do not pretend to be your equals in age or experience. He paused and looked around the amphitheater, meeting the eyes of as many delegates as he could. But I want to be honest with you, and I think honesty is something this room could use right now. A ripple of unease moved through the galleries. The elder species were not accustomed to being spoken to directly. The speaking ground was a place for careful, diplomatic language, for bowing and negotiating and thanking the Concord for its wisdom. It was not a place for honesty. "You have listed your concerns about humanity," Danny continued. "You say we expand too fast. You say our weapons are dangerous. You say our ideas are contaminating other species. You say our military tactics are irrational and unpredictable." I have listened to each of these accusations carefully, and I would like to respond to them, because I think you deserve to hear what we actually think. He turned to face the Rithani platform. "Ambassador, you accuse us of expanding too aggressively, but every system we have colonized was unclaimed under Galactic Free Settlement Law for at least 500 years. We did not take anyone's territory. We settled worlds that nobody else wanted, and we turned them into homes. If that makes you uncomfortable, I would ask you to consider why. Is it because we broke a law, or because we moved faster than you expected?" The Rithani ambassador's forearms shifted, but he said nothing. Danny turned to the drawl. "You condemn our weapons research. I understand your concern. Weapons are dangerous, and new weapons can change the balance of power. But I want to point out something that I think is important. In 112 years of spacefaring civilization, humanity has never used a weapon aggressively against any Concord species. Not once. We have fought defensive wars when we were attacked. We have protected our colonies when they were threatened. But we have never fired the first shot. Can every species in this room say the same?" The silence that followed was heavy with things that no one wanted to say out loud. Danny let it sit for a moment before moving on. He turned to the Arathi platform, and for the first time, something close to a smile appeared on his face. It was not a mocking smile. It was the smile of a man who found something genuinely interesting. "Ambassador, your accusation is the one that surprised me the most," he said. "You say that our culture is contaminating younger species, our music, our stories, our ideas. You say these things are dangerous." He paused. "I have spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what idea could possibly be so dangerous that one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy would travel across the stars to complain about it. And I think I know what it is." He looked directly at the Arathi representative. She sat perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on him. "It is the idea that individuals matter," Danny said, "that a single person, regardless of their species or their station or their birth, has the right to think for themselves and choose their own future. You call it contamination. We call it freedom. And if that idea frightens you, then I accept the accusation. I accept it proudly." A sound moved through the amphitheater. It was not applause. It was not protest. It was the sound of thousands of beings drawing breath at the same time, as if the air in the room had suddenly become thinner. In the upper galleries, where delegates from younger non-Concord species sat as observers, Danny could see faces turning toward each other with wide eyes. His words were reaching them. He turned to the Morvathi platform. The massive reptilian warrior sat motionless, watching Danny with the patient attention of a predator studying something it had not yet decided to kill. "Commander," Danny said, using the Morvathi military title as a sign of respect, "you say our tactics are irrational, that we take risks no sane species would take, that we fight when we should surrender, and refuse to stop when we should accept defeat." He nodded slowly. "You are right. We do, and I will tell you why." Danny took a step forward, closer to the Morvathi platform, and his voice dropped slightly, becoming quieter but somehow more intense. "We come from a world where we were not the strongest creatures. We were not the fastest. We did not have claws or fangs or venom or armor. We survived because we refused to stop, because when something bigger and stronger tried to kill us, we picked up a rock, or a stick, or a burning branch, and we fought back. Not because we were sure we could win, because giving up was worse than dying." He stepped back to the center of the speaking ground. "That is in our nature. You can call it irrational if you want, but it is the reason we are standing here today, in this room, among species that have had thousands of years to get used to being powerful. We have had 100 years, and you invited us here because in that 100 years, we have grown enough to make you nervous." He let that sink in. Then he changed direction. "But I do not want you to think that all we are is stubborn and dangerous, because that is not the whole truth about us, and you deserve the whole truth." Danny began to list things, not weapons or ships or territory. He listed the 17 times human ships had responded to distress signals from alien vessels, asking nothing in return. He described the medical breakthroughs that humanity had shared freely with over 40 species, treatments for diseases that had killed millions, genetic therapies that had extended lifespans, surgical techniques that alien doctors adopted and used to save their own people. He talked about the disaster relief teams that humanity sent to worlds they had no alliance with, no treaty with, no reason to help, except that someone was suffering, and humans could not stand by and watch. "We did not do those things because we wanted something," Danny said. "We did not do them to earn your respect or to buy your loyalty. We did them because helping people who need help is what we believe in. That is not a strategy. It is who we are." The amphitheater was deeply, profoundly still. Danny looked up at the 12 platforms one more time. He looked at the High Arbiter. He looked at the ancient faces of species who had been ruling the galaxy since before humanity built its first city. "You brought us here to tell us what we must give up," he said, "what we must stop doing, what we must become in order to make you comfortable. You want us to be smaller, quieter, slower, safer." He straightened his back. "We have heard your terms, and we would like time to think about them." High Arbiter Zelkan studied Danny for a long moment. His multifaceted eyes reflected the human back at himself 100 times over. Then he nodded, a slow and deliberate movement. "The Concord grants a recess of 6 standard hours," he said. "The human delegation may use the private chambers on the lower level to deliberate." Danny nodded. "Thank you." He turned and walked back to his team. Lillian was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Paul Beckett was gripping the arms of his chair. Grace Dunlap had not moved a single muscle during the entire speech. Nathan Call had tears in his eyes that he was trying very hard to hide. Danny sat down beside Lillian and let out a slow breath. That was not bad, she said quietly. It was not the hard part, he replied. She looked at him. What is the hard part? Danny did not answer, but his eyes moved to the great doors at the far end of the amphitheater, the doors through which they had entered, and he looked at them for a long time, as if measuring the distance, as if calculating how many steps it would take to walk through them and never come back. The private chamber they gave the humans was underground. It was a fine room by most standards, polished stone walls, soft lighting, comfortable seating, and a table stocked with food and drink suited to human biology. But Lillian noticed immediately that the ceiling was lower than it needed to be, and the furniture was slightly too small, as if it had been designed for beings who were expected to sit quietly and wait for instructions. It was a room for lesser species, a waiting room for those who had already decided to submit and just needed somewhere to sit while the paperwork was prepared. Danny noticed it too. He said nothing about it. He walked to the far end of the room, pulled out a chair, and sat down. The others followed. For a moment, nobody spoke. The weight of what had happened in the amphitheater pressed down on all of them, like gravity turned up a notch. Danny's words were still hanging in the air, still echoing in their memories. But words were one thing. What came next was something else entirely. Paul Beckett broke the silence. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and spoke in the measured, careful way that had made him one of the most respected voices in the human Congress. That was a hell of a speech, Danny, he said, and it needed to be said. But now we have to talk about what we actually do. Danny nodded. Paul continued. The way I see it, we have room to negotiate. We accept some of their terms, the ones that do not cripple us, and we push back hard on the rest. We ask for timelines. We ask for review periods. We buy ourselves 10, maybe 15 years, and by then our position will be strong enough that they will have to renegotiate from a weaker stance. It is not perfect, but it is realistic. It was the kind of argument that had kept humanity out of trouble 100 times before. The patient, pragmatic, give a little to get a little approach that diplomats had used since the first two villages decided it was better to trade than to fight. Grace Dunlap listened to Paul with her hands folded on the table. When he finished, she reached into her bag and pulled out a datapad. She set it on the table and turned it so everyone could see the screen. These are our fleet projections, she said. Her voice was flat and precise, the way it always was when she was talking about numbers that could mean life or death. Right now, the human navy is the 7th largest in the galaxy. In 10 years, we will be 4th. In 15, we will be 2nd. In 25 years, if our current growth continues, we will have more ships, more firepower, and more logistical capacity than any 3 Concord species combined. She tapped the screen, and a graph appeared, showing the curves of military growth for humanity and each of the elder species. The human line climbed steeply, while the others remained flat or grew slowly. The Concord knows this, Grace said. Their intelligence services are not stupid. They can see the same numbers we can. That is why they are acting now, while they still have the leverage to impose terms. If we accept restrictions today, we lock ourselves into a subordinate position during the exact window when we would otherwise surpass them. And once we accept, the precedent is set. They will use it to control us forever. Paul frowned. And if we refuse outright, what happens then? Grace looked at him steadily. That depends on whether they are willing to go to war over it. Are they? Danny asked. Nathan Cole, who had been sitting quietly with his datapad, spoke up for the first time. He took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a habit he had when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a very long time. I have studied the Concord for 15 years, he said. Their history, their politics, their decision-making patterns. And the single most important thing I can tell you about them is this. They have never had to deal with a species that said no. He let that statement settle in the room. In 9,000 years, every species that has been brought before the Grand Table has accepted the Concord's terms. Every one. Some negotiated around the edges, argued about details, asked for small changes. But in the end, they all accepted. Because the Concord's power is not just military, it is psychological. Every species in the galaxy has grown up believing that the Concord is the natural order of things. Challenging it is like challenging gravity. It is simply not something that reasonable beings do. Nathan put his glasses back on. The Concord has protocols for dealing with resistance. They have protocols for dealing with negotiation. They have protocols for dealing with anger, with threats, with pleas, with every possible response a species might give. But they do not have a protocol for a species that simply refuses to engage, because it has never happened. Lillian, who had been listening silently, leaned forward. You are saying that if we negotiate, we lose, because negotiation is a game they have been winning for 9,000 years. And if we fight, we lose, because they have protocols for that too. Yes, Nathan said. So what do we do? Paul asked. Nathan looked at Danny. We do the one thing they cannot predict. The one thing they have no protocol for. The one thing that no species in the history of the galaxy has ever done. The room was very quiet. Danny stood up. He walked to the wall and placed his hand against the cold stone. He could feel the vibration of the complex around him, the hum of alien technology that was older than human civilization. Somewhere above him, 10,000 beings were waiting for him to come back and begin the process of giving in. He thought about Kentucky. He thought about the farm where he grew up, the wide-open fields and the sky that stretched from one edge of the world to the other. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in a war on Earth long before humans ever reached the stars, and who used to say that a man is not defined by the fights he wins, but by the things he refuses to give up. Danny turned back to his team. We are not going to negotiate, he said. We are not going to argue. We are not going to make counteroffers or ask for compromises or try to buy time. Paul opened his mouth, but Danny continued. We are going to walk back into that amphitheater, and we are going to tell them that we decline their terms. All of them. And then we are going to walk out. The silence in the room was absolute. Just walk out, Lillian repeated. Just walk out, Danny confirmed. No anger, no threats, no dramatic speeches. We say no, and we leave, and we go home. Paul stood up. His face was tight with concern. Danny, do you understand what you are suggesting? We are talking about the most powerful alliance in the galaxy. If we walk out, we are telling them that their authority means nothing to us. That 9,000 years of galactic order means nothing to us. That could have consequences we cannot even begin to predict. I know, Danny said. They could impose sanctions. They could blockade our trade routes. They could coordinate military action against our colonies, Grace said. They could, Danny agreed, but they will not. Not immediately. Because Nathan is right. They have no protocol for this. When we walk out of that room, every species on every platform is going to look at each other and realize that they have no idea what to do next. And while they are figuring it out, while they are arguing and debating and trying to understand what just happened, we will be going home, building our ships, growing our colonies, living our lives. He continued. He looked at each of them in turn. Every species that has ever stood on that speaking ground chose to kneel. They chose safety. They chose predictability. They chose to be managed. I am not going to make that choice. Not for us, not for the people back home, not for every generation of humans that comes after us. I will have the Resolute Dawn prepped for departure within the hour, she said, and for the first time since they had left Earth, she smiled. Nathan nodded slowly, as if something he had been studying for 15 years had finally made sense. Lillian stood up and straightened her jacket. Well, she said, I guess I should figure out how to say goodbye in 12 alien languages. Danny looked at Paul. The congressman was standing very still, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. Danny knew what Paul was feeling, because he was feeling it too. The fear, the weight, the knowledge that what they were about to do could not be undone. Paul met his eyes. He was quiet for a long time. "My grandfather stormed a beach once," Paul said finally. "He told me that the bravest thing he ever did was not charging forward. It was deciding not to turn back." Danny took it. "Let us go show the galaxy what humans are made of," Paul said. And together, the five of them walked out of the waiting room and headed back toward the amphitheater, toward the grand table, toward the most powerful species in the galaxy. Not to kneel, not to fight, not to beg, just to leave. When the recess ended, the amphitheater filled again. 10,000 beings settled into their seats with the comfortable certainty of those who already know how the story ends. On the elevated platforms, the elder species arranged themselves with the practiced ease of civilizations that had been sitting in judgment for millennia. Aides whispered final notes to their ambassadors. Junior diplomats prepared the formal language of humanity's submission. Some delegates from the lower galleries were already composing messages to their homeworlds, assuring their governments that the human problem had been managed, that the young species had been brought into line, that the natural order of the galaxy remained intact. On the Veloxy platform, High Arbiter Zelkan sat motionless, his dark carapace catching the light of the twin suns. He had presided over 47 such ceremonies in his long life. He knew how they went. The young species would return to the speaking ground. There would be some careful words about cooperation and mutual respect. There would be token requests for minor adjustments to the terms. And in the end, there would be acceptance. There was always acceptance. The great doors at the far end of the amphitheater opened, and the human delegation entered. Danny Whitmore walked at the front. Lillian was at his right shoulder, Paul at his left. Grace and Nathan followed close behind. They were 5 people walking into a room that held 10,000, and they moved with a quiet, unhurried certainty that made the air around them feel different. Something about the way they carried themselves caught the attention of the delegates nearest the aisle. Heads turned, eyes followed. The speaking ground was directly ahead of them, the circular patch of floor where they were expected to stand and deliver their concessions. The entire room waited for them to step onto it. They did not. Danny Whitmore walked past the speaking ground. He did not slow down. He did not look at it. He walked past it as if it were not there, and the 4 people behind him followed without breaking stride. A murmur began in the galleries, quiet at first, like the sound of wind through tall grass. Delegates leaned forward in their seats. On the elevated platforms, ambassadors exchanged glances. Something was wrong. The humans were not stopping. They were not taking their place. They were walking toward the exit. Danny stopped at the threshold of the great doors. He turned around slowly and faced the assembled concord of 12. The amphitheater stretched before him, a vast bowl of alien faces staring down at a single human standing in front of an open doorway with the stars at his back. He spoke clearly, and the translation matrices carried his words to every ear, every receptor, every sensory organ in the room. "We have considered your terms," he said. "We decline. All of them." The amphitheater did not go quiet. It went still. There is a difference. Quiet is the absence of sound. Stillness is the absence of movement, of thought, of breath. 10,000 beings sat frozen, as if time itself had stuttered and forgotten to start again. Danny continued. His voice was steady and measured, and it carried no anger, no defiance, no bravado. It carried something worse. It carried calm. Humanity will continue to settle unclaimed systems as galactic law permits. We will continue our research into every field of science and technology that we believe is important. We will continue to share our culture, our medicine, and our aid with any species that wants them. And we will continue to build the ships and the defenses necessary to protect our people and our way of life." He paused for a single breath. "You built this room to make others feel small. You built those platforms so you could look down on anyone who stood before you. Every species that has ever come here has accepted that arrangement. They stood on your speaking ground and looked up at you and agreed to be less than what they could be, because you told them that was the price of peace." His eyes moved across the 12 platforms, from the Veloxi to the Rithani, from the Drawl to the Morvathi, from the Urathi to every other elder species that sat in the seats of power. "We came here as equals," Danny said, "and you treated us as subjects. So we are leaving." He took a step backward, closer to the open doors. "Not in anger. We do not hate you. Not in defiance for its own sake. We are not trying to prove anything. We are leaving because the things you asked us to give up are not ours to give. They belong to every human who will ever be born, every child who will look up at the stars and wonder what is out there. We will not trade their future for your comfort." Danny Whitmore turned his back on the grand table of the Concord of 12. Lillian Marsh fell into step on his right, Paul Beckett on his left, Grace Dunlap and Nathan Cole behind them. 5 humans walking out of the most powerful room in the galaxy, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stone, and not one of them looked back. The great doors closed behind them. For a long, terrible moment, nobody in the amphitheater moved. High Arbiter Zelkan's translation matrix clicked and hummed, cycling through thousands of archived protocols, searching for the correct response to what had just happened. In 9,000 years of Concord history, no species had ever walked away from the grand table. The protocol did not exist. The possibility had never been considered. Then the whispers started, quiet and uncertain at first, like small creatures emerging after a storm. Ambassadors turned to their aides. Aides turned to their data pads. Military advisors began pulling up fleet dispositions and strategic projections that they had never expected to need. On the Morvathi platform, the great reptilian commander sat forward in his seat and stared at the closed doors with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something dangerously close to respect. On the observation deck of the symposium complex, a young Orathi diplomat named Solani stood at the window and watched the human shuttle climb into the sky. She was 23 years old by the standard of her species, barely an adult, and she had spent her entire education being taught that the Concord was eternal and unquestionable. She had been raised to believe that order was the highest virtue, and that stability was the foundation upon which all civilizations were built. She watched the shuttle dock with the resolute dawn. She watched the carrier's engines begin to glow as it prepared to leave orbit. And she felt something open inside her chest. Something that had no name in her language, but that humans had been writing songs about for thousands of years. It felt like possibility. The news spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Within hours, every major species had received the reports. Humanity had walked away. Humanity had said no. The youngest civilization in the galaxy had stood before the 12 most powerful species in existence, looked them in the eye, and refused to kneel. The Concord called an emergency session within 2 days. The amphitheater that had been so ordered and certain was now a storm of raised voices and clashing opinions. The Veloxi demanded sanctions. The Drawl pushed for a trade embargo. The Rithani suggested a complete blockade of human-controlled space. The Morvathi, to the surprise of everyone, said nothing at all. They just sat and listened, and their silence made everyone nervous. But every proposal stalled. The 12 species could not agree on a response, because every option they considered required them to answer a question that none of them were prepared for. What do you do about a species that does not want to fight you, does not want to join you, does not want to trade with you on your terms, and does not seem to want anything from you at all. A species that simply said no and went home? Sanctions required enforcement, and enforcement required ships, and ships required coordination, and coordination required agreement, and agreement required trust. And after 9,000 years of ruling through hierarchy, the 12 elder species discovered that they did not actually trust each other very much at all. The Concord's unity had always been maintained by having someone beneath them to manage. Without a willing subject, the cracks began to show. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. 17 younger species, civilizations that had been quietly living under the Concord's shadow for centuries, reached out to humanity through private diplomatic channels. They did not go through the Concord. They bypassed it entirely, something that had not happened in recorded history. Trade offers arrived at human embassies. Cultural exchange programs were proposed. Military alliances were discussed in quiet rooms on quiet worlds, far from the Concord's listening posts. A Rithani trade captain, acting against the wishes of her own government, docked at a human station and offered to open a private shipping route between human space and the outer colonies. When asked why, she said simply, "I watched the broadcast. I have been waiting my whole life to see someone do what you did." Danny Whitmore returned to Earth 3 weeks after leaving Varith Prime. The Resolute Dawn docked at the orbital station, and Danny took a shuttle down to the surface. He went home to Kentucky and sat on the porch of his family's farmhouse and watched the sun go down over the fields. A reporter tracked him down 2 days later. She asked him what message he had wanted to send to the galaxy. He looked out at the fields, at the sky turning orange and purple above the tree line, at the first stars appearing in the darkening blue. "We did not send a message," he said. "We just left. If the galaxy wants to know who we are, they can watch what we do next." Across 1,000 star systems, on 1,000 worlds, in languages spoken with tongues and mandibles and pheromone glands and electromagnetic pulses, they did exactly that. They watched. The elder species watched with calculation, trying to figure out their next move. The younger species watched with something brighter and more dangerous than curiosity. They watched with hope. And on Varith Prime, in the empty amphitheater where no speaking ground had ever been abandoned, where no doors had ever closed on the backs of a departing species, the High Arbiter sat alone in the fading light of the twin suns, and understood for the first time in his ancient life that the galaxy had changed, not because of a war, not because of a weapon, not because of a treaty or a threat or a show of force, because 5 humans walked through a door and did not look back, and the silence they left behind was louder than anything the Concord had ever heard. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it changed everything. It came through the Deep Space Relay Network in a format that no human communication system had ever received before. The encoding was ancient, layered with diplomatic seals from species that had been writing treaties since before humans learned to make fire. It took Dr. Lillian Marsh nearly 6 hours to decode it, sitting alone in her cramped office at the United Earth Diplomatic Corps headquarters in Boston, drinking cold coffee and muttering to herself in 3 alien languages. When she finally understood what the message said, she set her cup down very slowly and stared at the screen for a long time. Humanity had been invited to the Grand Symposium of the Concord of 12. In the year 2387, humanity was still considered a baby among the stars. They had been traveling between systems for just over 100 years. They had colonies on 47 worlds. They had a respectable navy and a growing reputation for being stubborn, resourceful, and surprisingly difficult to push around. But in the eyes of the galaxy's elder species, humans were barely worth noticing. They were loud, they were messy, they bred too fast and expanded too eagerly, and had an annoying habit of showing up uninvited to help during disasters, whether anyone asked them to or not. The Concord of 12 was the oldest and most powerful alliance in the known galaxy. 12 elder species, each with civilizations stretching back thousands of years, governed interstellar law, trade routes, weapons treaties, and territorial claims. Their authority had gone unchallenged for over 9,000 years. They did not invite young species to their table. Young species waited, sometimes for centuries, sometimes forever. So when the invitation arrived, every alien embassy on Earth went into a quiet panic. Lillian could see it in the way the Rithani ambassador suddenly canceled all his appointments. She could hear it in the nervous clicking of the Arathi trade liaison, who called her office 4 times in one afternoon, pretending to ask about unrelated paperwork. They were afraid, not of the invitation itself, but of what it meant. Lillian brought the decoded message to Admiral Whitmore's office aboard the carrier Resolute Dawn, which was docked at the orbital station above Earth. Captain Danny Whitmore was not the kind of man who looked like he belonged in command of the most advanced warship in the human fleet. He was tall but not imposing, with a weathered face and calm brown eyes that made him look more like a farmer than a soldier. He had, in fact, grown up on a farm in rural Kentucky, and he still carried himself with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had spent his youth working the land, before he ever looked up at the stars. Danny read the invitation twice, then set it down on his desk. "They want us at Verith Prime," he said, "the neutral world." "In 6 weeks," Lillian confirmed. She sat across from him, her dark hair pulled back, her sharp eyes watching his face for a reaction. She had known Danny for 7 years, and she had learned that the less he said, the more he was thinking. "Why now?" he asked. Lillian pulled up a datapad and handed it to him. "Intelligence thinks the Concord is preparing to impose restrictions on us. Fleet caps, colonization boundaries, limits on weapons research, and FTL development. They want to box us in before we get too big." Danny looked at the data for a long time. Humanity's growth rate was faster than any species the Concord had ever encountered. Their technology was advancing at a pace that made the elder species uncomfortable. In another 15 or 20 years, the human fleet would rival anything the Concord could put together. The elder species could see the trajectory, and they did not like where it was heading. "So it is not really an invitation," Danny said quietly. "It is a summons." "Yes," Lillian said, "and if we do not go, they will take that as defiance and act accordingly. If we do go, they expect us to listen to their terms and accept them." Danny leaned back in his chair. Through the viewport behind him, Earth hung in the blackness of space, blue and white and impossibly fragile. "Who else is on the delegation?" he asked. Lillian told him. Congressman Paul Beckett had been chosen as the political representative. Paul was a former Marine who had served in the Second Colonial War before entering politics. He was a careful man, a man who believed in compromise and patience, and he carried the kind of quiet authority that came from having survived things he never talked about. Commander Grace Dunlap would serve as military advisor. Grace was small and soft-spoken, and had a reputation for being the calmest person in any room, which was useful because the rooms she tended to be in were usually on fire. And Dr. Nathan Cole, a cultural anthropologist who had spent 15 years studying alien societies, would round out the team. Nathan believed that understanding how aliens thought was more valuable than any weapon humanity could build, and he was probably right. Danny met with all of them that evening in the Resolute Dawn's briefing room. The ship hummed quietly around them as they sat around a steel table and looked at the intelligence reports spread out before them. "The Concord has done this before," Nathan said, adjusting his glasses. He was a thin man with a gentle voice, who always looked slightly rumpled, as if he had just woken up from a nap in a library. "Every time a younger species starts growing too fast, the Concord invites them to the table and presents them with conditions. In 9,000 years, no species has ever refused." "What happens if they refuse?" Grace asked. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "Nobody knows," Nathan said, "because nobody ever has." The room was quiet for a moment. Paul Beckett spoke up. He had a deep voice and a careful way of choosing his words, as if each one cost him something. "We should go in ready to negotiate. Find the terms we can live with. Push back on the ones we cannot, and try to buy ourselves time. That is the smart play." Danny listened to all of them. He asked questions. He read the reports again. He looked at the star charts, showing humanity's colonies, their trade routes, their defense perimeters. He looked at the projections, showing where humanity would be in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, if no one stopped them. Then he stood up and walked to the viewport. The stars stretched out before him, endless and cold and full of possibility. "We will go," he said. "We will listen to what they have to say, and then we will decide what kind of species we want to be." Lillian watched him standing there, silhouetted against the stars, and she felt something shift in the room. It was not fear, exactly. It was the feeling you get when you realize that the ground beneath your feet is about to move, and there is nothing you can do except choose where to stand. 3 days later, the Resolute Dawn broke orbit and set course for Verath Prime. Behind them, Earth grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light in the darkness. Ahead of them, the galaxy waited. And somewhere in the ancient halls of the Concord of 12, the elder species were preparing their chains. They just did not know yet that humans had never been very good at wearing them.